The Taliban's media office has told U.S. President Donald Trump to let them know when he's ready to discuss Washington's exit from Afghanistan. Their response comes after Donald Trump rejected the idea of holding peace talks with the Taliban. Speaking at the White House, the U.S. president condemned the group for its actions in Afghanistan's capital and pledged to finish what was started. Meanwhile, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction issued a report on Monday stating that the Pentagon has limited data on U.S. war efforts in Afghanistan. The news comes after Kabul was hit by several deadly assaults in recent weeks. On Monday, a deadly attack on the Marshal Fahim Military Academy in the Afghani capital left at least 5 people dead and 10 injured. The attack comes after a deadly blast hit the diplomatic quarter of Kabul on Saturday, where embassies and many government buildings are located. It was perpetrated by a terrorist who blew up an ambulance packed with explosives in a crowded street, killing 103 people and injuring more than 200.
And joining us live over the phone to discuss this in further depth is Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis, Associate Professor of Politics at the Intelligence and National Security Studies program at Coastal Carolina University. Thank you so much for joining us, Dr. Fitsanakis.
Good to be here. Thank you.
So now some experts have said that Trump's comments suggest that he actually sees a military victory over the Taliban. Do you think that that's likely? And, you know, with the current resources and manpower that he has authorized?
Well, it's true that President Trump has increased the number of U.S. troops in Afghanistan from about 8,000 or so to currently 14,000. And he said that he wants to send another 1,000. Having said that, let's just remember that in 2010, the U.S. had in Afghanistan about 100,000 troops, and these were not enough to actually score a victory against the Taliban. So why would anybody think that 15,000 troops would be enough to do that today?
It's been 15 years of fighting. Many actually say that the U.S.-led coalition has not, in fact, made a significant impact on the number of terrorists, and that the number of terrorists are, in fact, growing stronger. And what are your thoughts on that? How would you summarize the 15 years of fighting led by the U.S. coalition?
I mean, we can just see the results of this. Currently, by all accounts, the Taliban controls about a third of Afghanistan. It's stronger now than it's been in the last 10 years for sure. And in addition to that, you've got ISIS there now, the Islamic State, that is also active. ISIS last year alone claimed about 15 bombings throughout the country. The situation can be described as desperate. I wouldn't say that the Taliban has the possibility or the chance to take over Afghanistan. It's not strong enough to do so, plus it doesn't have that much support by the local people. Having said that, currently the last week or so showed that really nobody is safe in the country. There's no way out of this that doesn't involve some kind of a settlement with the Taliban in the immediate future.
Right, and it's also, it's strange that not so long ago when Donald Trump first authorized additional troops, he actually said that, he wanted to force the Taliban to negotiate for a political settlement. Why now do we see this change of course, and why is he refusing? Why do you think he's refusing to negotiate with them now?
I don't think that we can say with certainty what Trump's intentions are in Afghanistan, because he is a kind of president that seems to change his mind or change his rhetoric on a regular basis. I think, in fact, that is the primary cause of the attacks that we saw in the past week in Afghanistan. The Taliban want to ensure that he negotiates with them, which is why they're trying to show to him, to the American-led coalition, and to the Afghan government that they're able to strike at any time, anywhere in the country. And they want to create that impression so as to appear strong enough when and if they happen to be called in at the table of negotiations with the American-led coalition.
What do you think the aim is of the U.S. in keeping its presence in the country then?
I really don't think that the U.S. at this point has any concrete strategy of what it wants to achieve in Afghanistan. The numbers of U.S. troops are not even remotely sufficient to secure the country. In fact, they never have been. The U.S. never has been serious enough about achieving the goal of stabilization of Afghanistan. I mean, let me just remind you back in the early days when the U.S. was focused on the country post 9/11, it got really distracted very quickly by the war in Iraq. There's been a succession of U.S. military commanders that have complained that they've never had enough troops in the country. The country itself is not large in terms of population, but it is very mountainous and has a difficult terrain. So if you were serious about stabilizing it using a military force, we're talking about having at least 250,000 troops, if not closer to 1 million, if you're serious about this. And at this point, nobody in Washington or, in fact, in the U.S. population has the will to do something like that. Trump is aware of that. At the same time, though, he is the kind of president that wants to appear strong. He doesn't want to be seen as sort of failing in his international obligations. So it's a very polarized image, one that not quite sure how it's going to end up.
When we talk about U.S. policies in the country, how could you describe U.S. policy strategy in Afghanistan? If they don't have enough presence, then what exactly is it that they're doing?
I think you can analyze U.S. policy in the country on two main parameters. One is the military parameter, which we've done in the past few minutes, but also it has to do with the Afghan government that the U.S. currently supports. I mean, there's no question that President Ashraf Ghani presides over a coalition of forces in the country that is plagued by all kinds of infighting, all kinds of rivalries between them. They are corrupt, and the Afghan people are aware of that. Polls are being conducted regularly across the country, and it seems that more than 80% of people think the country is heading in the wrong direction. The Afghan security forces are severely understaffed. They themselves are corrupt. They're weak. About 10,000 of them died last year alone in fighting all over the country. And every single day, at least 10 to 12 Afghans die across the country because of terrorism-related incidents. So it's really a desperate image. And again, there's no clear end in sight. I'm not sure what Washington has in mind in regards to policy in Afghanistan.
Now, we've seen a terrible spate of attacks recently, with so many deaths, really tragic. And, what is the situation with terrorism? To what extent do terrorists currently control Afghanistan?
As I mentioned before, the Taliban currently control about a third of the country, which is significant. Having said that, the attacks themselves are not that surprising. They're somewhat predictable. Part of their mission of the Taliban is to send a message to Washington, but the other part of the mission is to make it known to the local population, especially in Kabul, that they should not rely on the protection and the services provided by the Afghan government and the U.S. coalition. They want to make it risky for people to rely on those services. For example, the use of ambulances. And their goal is to make sure that they create a vacuum, basically drive away the government from large parts of the country's territory so that they can then step in and provide those services. I mean, one of the success of the Taliban in the past has been not so much their military abilities, but their ability to actually provide services for the populations that are under their command. They've showed before they can do this quite effectively, plus they can secure those places more effectively than the government. And as a result, what they're hoping to do is to get the people on their side.
And the Taliban are the only terrorist organization that are operating right now? Or are there other organizations?
The Islamic State is also operating among some of the warlords and some of the younger Taliban members, the Pashtun tribesmen, who are somewhat impatient about an end to this war. They've been quite popular in the last year or two, but they cannot be compared in size and strength to that of the Taliban. The Taliban, let me remind you, are the biggest terrorist group in the country. They represent much of the Pashtun tribesmen and women, and they have a long history of presence in the country. It goes back even to the days of the Soviet-Afghan War. So even though there are more than one groups, can't disregard the power of the Taliban. And that includes, of course, the Haqqani network, which is primarily responsible for the last attack in Kabul this past week.
Isn't it quite paradoxical, though? I mean, you're saying that they represent so many people, and yet they're killing so many people, and there's so much bloodshed. What is it that they what is it that they want, really?
Basically, in a situation like this, in a war situation, most people will side with whichever actor ensures their security and safety. The Taliban's message is that so long as the Americans are here, so long as there's a government in Kabul that is controlled by the United States and the U.S.-led coalition, the war will not end. And most people tend to be in the middle of this. And so if the Taliban can show people that they can provide the same services the government can provide, but do so in a more secure fashion, most people will side with them without any reference to democracy or freedom or human rights. What they care about primarily is survival. And if the Afghan Taliban can show the population that if they're in control of an area, there will be no bombing, no killing, no terrorist attacks, then most people will actually do that, will side with them. And that typically is what happens in war. We've seen the same thing in Iraq, we've seen the same thing in Yemen, in Somalia, etc. So Afghanistan is no exception.
Really have to ask you this question. If there were to be talks between Trump and the Taliban, what do you think they would be about? What would the Taliban probably request, or what would be their terms for peace?
Well, I think the Taliban are aware of the fact that they're not the most popular force in the country, but they do have a lot of support in the mountains between Afghanistan and Pakistan. What they will ask for is basically some guarantee of their ability to basically create a separatist government in the country. I mean, they've always wanted essentially to be separate from both the Afghan and the Pakistani governments. I mean, the Taliban are essentially the Pashtuns of the country, and it is an ethnic alliance of warlords who just do not want to be ruled by Kabul. Most Pashtuns who live in Afghanistan have no connection to Kabul. They don't want to be ruled by Kabul, and they want to be basically left alone to live their lives as an independent, basically, force. The idea of Afghanistan as a unified nation is a Western conception. It doesn't really represent reality. So they will pressure for more secessionist rights and abilities.
And do you think that they could actually come to some kind of an agreement?
I mean, the thing is, the U.S. has in the past spoken with the Taliban. There's been negotiations between the U.S., indirectly through the Afghan government and the Taliban. There was a time back in 2015, 2016, when it looked like, a settlement was very close. The idea being, of course, that this 16-year-long war in Afghanistan must end with some kind of a political settlement, because no side at this point is strong enough to really win the war. But as with everything else, when the government changed in Washington, everything went up in the air, and nobody is certain at this point what exactly President Trump intends to do. Let me remind you that back in 2016, when he was running for president, he made a point of saying that he wanted to basically pull back from all these wars and focus on domestic U.S. problems. But this does not appear so far to be the case.
Right. Well, thank you so much for joining us. It's been a fascinating conversation. I've been talking to Dr. Joseph Fitsanakis, Associate Professor of Politics at the Intelligence and National Security Studies Program, Coastal Carolina University.